Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
The destiny of America is always
If I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Thursday, May 21st, 2020. I'm Michael Brooks. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report, where each broadcasting steps from the literal. Be really clear, some people don't get this. We literally mean that heartland of America. On today's program, John Nichols, editor at The Nation magazine and journalist, his new book, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, a biography of both Henry Wallace and the Democratic Party itself. Great, fascinating history. A new report from Columbia University suggests that 36,000 lives could have been saved if lockdowns went into place even just a week or so earlier. Workers file another 2.4 million unemployment claims as the pandemic fueled, and maybe other factors as well, depression hurdles forward. But Mitch McConnell, very clear that he wants to get rid of enhanced unemployment benefits in the next stop measure bill. Senior officials advised Trump against emergency arms sales to Saudi. The under question Secretary of State Mike Pompeo dodged the advice. Warren changes her tune even more on Medicare for All in a bid to be Biden's VP, but which VP polls the best? Trump withdraws from the Open Skies Arms Control Treaty, scrapping another key element of the global arms control framework. Opinion polls suggest that Biden is widening his lead by up points over Donald Trump. White House's own data crunchers suggest that southern counties are about to get hit very hard by coronaviruses. Death toll continues. Corona testing is a mess, according to a University of Minnesota Center for Infectious Disease and Research Policy report. And Trump escalates his campaign to discredit mail voting. Mail balloting, threatening federal funds in 2 battleground states. I wonder why he doesn't want it to be easier for people to vote. And a child deportation surge amidst the pandemic was already in the works going back to 2017 and only accelerating now. Emergency relief screws up to 5 million student loan borrowers. They got the relief, but their credit scores got dinged. And Brazil, Donald Trump's kindred spirit, Bolsonaro, has led his country to a record high in new corona cases. All that, as well as a really brilliant proposal spearheaded by Amy Klobuchar and Ben Sasse, 4,000 in skill training credits to workers displaced by the coronavirus. Practically FDR-esque in terms of boldness, vision, and meeting the moment from Amy Klobuchar, Ben Sasse, Cory Booker, and one other. Who was the last senator that co-sponsored this dreck? Tim Scott, Republican from South Carolina. So bipartisan nonsense. Not even a piece of tape on a leaking yacht. Guys, Matt, Brendan, how is everybody?
Staying alive.
Staying alive.
Yeah, another Thursday. We're back.
Another Thursday. We're back.
The bros.
So Trump his poll numbers are not looking great right now. It isn't just the sort of national head-to-heads, but the battleground polls are starting to show steady leads for Biden. Obviously, very early in the campaign, Democratic Party, absolutely wretched, incompetent. Republican Party, absolutely wretched and ruthless. Things can change. But serious trouble for Trump if there is an election in November. And he, like every other Republican, wants to make it as hard for people that might vote against him to vote as possible. We're in the middle of a pandemic, so the logistical case for mail-in voting is on its face. Don't want people in large crowded areas. Let them fill out a ballot at home, mail it in. This works effectively, no problem. Donald Trump is crusading against it. And again, big part of a longer Republican push. Republicans on the state level and the Supreme Court have been undermining and attacking voting rights for well over a decade. And Donald Trump has fixated on conspiracy theories and delusions and fantasy about undocumented people voting to soothe his ego because he lost the popular vote by over 3 million votes in 2016. Here he is yesterday at the White House suggesting that a core constitutional guarantee is an honor.
Common sense would tell you that it's massive manipulation can take place. Massive. And you have cases of fraudulent ballots where they actually print them and they give them to people to sign. Maybe the same person signs them with different writing, different pens. I don't know. There's a lot of things can happen. No, if you can, you should go and vote. Voting is an honor. It shouldn't be something where they send you a pile of stuff and you send it back. Another thing that happens, a lot of people in certain districts, this is historically, a lot of people in certain districts don't ever get their ballot. They keep going, where's my vote? Where's my ballot? Then election day passes and they forget about it. And that can happen in the thousands. I'm not saying it does, but it can. It probably has.
What I love about Trump there is he's going from repeating familiar Republican myths and lies about fraud, which we'll talk about in a second, and then just going to like a general, there could be problems. That's very Trump, just the ultimate, he can be such a school marm concern troll. They always talk about this. Voter fraud. Let's go to the Brennan Center and get a couple of pieces of it, because common sense might tell you some things, but reality might tell you something quite different. This is a report from the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law, debunking voter fraud myths. A comprehensive 2014 study in the Washington Post found 31 credible instances of impersonation and fraud from 2000 to 2014. 31 credible. That's not even that we know that they are. That just means maybe this isn't a Republican fever dream.
Those were some tough hombres.
Those were some tough hombres. That is 31 credible instances of 1 billion ballots cast. 2 studies done. I'll just read one more thing. Everybody should read the whole report. You're going to need to, share this with friends and family, because the Republican war on voting rights is going to be in overdrive. 2 studies done at the Arizona State University, one in 2012, another in 2016, found similarly negligible rates of impersonation fraud. The project found 10 cases of voter impersonation fraud nationwide from 2000 to 2012. The follow-up study, which looked for fraud specifically in states where politicians have argued that fraud is a pernicious problem, wait for it, found zero successful persecutions for impersonation fraud in 5 states from 2012 to 2016. A review of the 2016 election. It goes on and on. And here's a piece in the Washington Post. There have been just 4 documented cases of voter fraud in 2016 election.
It's a really small tip of a really big iceberg.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. There could be a lot more. And be very clear. I mean, again, this is the classic example where Donald Trump's crazy bullshit musings synchronize with a policy and legal agenda that has been waging a war on low-income people, obviously people of color, young people, anybody that votes against Republicans.
Yeah. We may not be a democracy, but we're more of a democracy than the Republicans and certain Democrats want us to be. So
there's no doubt about that.
So take it seriously, folks.
There's no doubt about that.
Political franchise, good and important.
100%. Brendan, you had expressed concern about lack of voter ID. I was kidding.
Yeah, I think everyone needs to get. I think there are a lot of creative possibilities. We could have, barcodes. When people get their Bill Gates vaccine.
I was just going to say that.
The Bill Gates vaccine.
Hey,
wow, you want to mix up the Bill. So, in other words, you want the Bill Gates vaccine to be part of a vote monitoring program?
I think it'd be very efficient system. I think there's a lot of potential there.
I like that. That's sort of that's actually kind of like a grand bargain between the globalists and the nativists right there. All right, we're going to take a brief break and we'll come right back with John Nichols. He's author of The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, The Enduring Legacy of Henry Wallace's Anti-Fascist, Anti-Racist Politics. This is a great book, folks. Actually,
we're just going to bring him on.
We're just going to bring him on. I'm still used to that.
Right, yeah, no, I know.
Sorry about that. I guess we're just going to bring him right on.
Yeah.
Very eager for this conversation.
Yeah, here he comes. Let's take a little bit to get connected here.
Hey there.
John, how you doing? I'm great, brother. We're live. As you heard, I guess we don't have a transition break. So
I like that.
We are straight to it.
Yeah.
John Nichols from The Nation magazine. He's author many books, but most recently, and the book we'll be discussing today, is The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party. And let me see, where is the subtitle? I lost my page here. I got to say this. The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, The Enduring Legacy of Henry Wallace's Anti-Fascist, Anti-Racist Politics. John Nichols, how are you, my friend?
I am well, my friend, and I'm honored to be with you. Are we linked up in all the ways that we should be?
We are linked up in all the ways that we should be, and we are cooking.
We don't have video, John. Do you want
we don't have John. Sorry, I didn't even see that, John.
Let me make sure we do that. Hang on here. Start video.
There we go. We got you. Well, no.
We had you for a second, and then we lost you again.
I'm
you go.
Mysterious.
There we are.
Honored to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. Well, John, Anna and I had you on the Jacobins weekend show that we co-host, and that conversation, which I recommend everybody obviously go and watch too, there was just so much richness in it that I wanted to have another conversation with you, and frankly another. I'll have you on TMBS hopefully in June. There's so many different threads that we can pull from here, but just start by reminding everybody of who Henry Wallace was and how he fits into, I guess, 2 parts. Who was Henry Wallace, and how does he fit into an actual American progressive tradition?
That is a very good set of questions. And the best way to begin is to say that Henry Wallace was a farmer. He was born in a very rural part of Iowa, Orient Township in Adair County. And grew up in a farm family. His family not only farmed on the ground, but they also were active in agricultural activism and editing a farm paper. And that's how he came to be known. Their paper was called Wallace's Farmer, and he was its editor. It was a progressive Republican tradition that he came out of. He split with the Republicans often. And in 1932, in the most important split with the Republicans for him, he met a young candidate for president, guy who's just a couple years older than him, Franklin Roosevelt, who asked for his support. Wallace gave that support and then entered the New Deal administration in March of 1933 as part of the first wave. He was one of Roosevelt's first appointees as Secretary of Agriculture. People today may have a hard time wrapping their heads around it, but at that time, the Department of Agriculture was the dynamic force of the New Deal. It was where rural electrification and farm and food programs, but also so many employment programs, so much of the innovation came from there. And he so impressed progressives across the country, labor, farm, rural, urban folks, as well as activists on behalf of social and racial justice, with his focus, his approach, that he became a very popular figure on the left in the party. And in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt pushed aside his Southern segregationist vice president and brought Wallace onto the ticket at a point where the party really pivoted to the left. And Wallace fought very, very hard to keep the Democratic Party as a progressive party. And we'll talk more about the brutal fights that went on from there. But at the heart of the matter, it's best to say that in 1943, 1944, I believe it was the Washington Post, other publications would say that Henry Wallace almost single-handedly is keeping the flame of the New Deal lit and shoring up Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, it was Roosevelt's vision, and Roosevelt gets the credit here, but at a point during World War II when so much of the energy was pulled toward the necessary war against global fascism, it was Henry Wallace who was saying, yes, we can win this war, and then we need to come home and we have to fight against Americanized fascism, which is division on the basis of race, gender, class. So he was a remarkable figure who's now been largely written out of our history.
Why has he been written out of our history?
That's the great question. He flew too close to the sun. He tried really, really hard to bring American politics from the 19th century to the 21st century. And he tried to do it in a matter of 2 or 3 years, and eventually became enormously popular. This is 1942, 1943, 1944. Enormously popular with working class folks, enormously popular with a really intersectional, broad-based coalition. So the power in the party, the bankers, the Southern segregationists, the big city bosses, really determined that he had to be stopped. And they threw all of their energy in the spring and summer of 1944 into knocking him off the ticket. Now, Franklin Roosevelt said before the 1944 Democratic National Convention that if he was a delegate, he would have voted for Henry Wallace. But he said it with a softness because it was the midst of a war. He did not want the party, he wanted to hold the party together. And because of the divisions within it, he let party leaders push Wallace aside. They brought in Harry Truman, who many people have high regard for, but Truman was a much more centrist, much more cautious figure. And Wallace chose to fight on. He fought on at Roosevelt's side. Roosevelt brought him back into the administration as Secretary of Commerce. Roosevelt and Wallace had a plan for the post-war fight to create 60 million new jobs, to assure that you could keep the women who had gone into the workforce working, to assure that African Americans who had integrated defense industries would keep jobs and would transition into new jobs, and to bring returning vets into jobs. It was a visionary plan. It went along with a housing plan. But the fact of the matter is he was pushed out of the Truman administration. He then chose to battle Truman in 1948, running a Popular Front candidacy that had backing from socialists, radicals, communists, some union folks, many early civil rights campaigners, but was quickly marginalized by the media and by the political elites of his time, and really pushed out of politics. So he spent the last 15 years of his life back on the farm. And in many ways, he chose to step away. And unfortunately, the histories quickly wrote him out. And I think the truth of the matter, Michael, is he was written out because he was inconvenient. Here was a guy who said in 1943, racism was Americanized fascism. Here was a guy who said in 1944, we have to pass the Equal Rights Amendment immediately because women are coming into the workforce and we've got to protect their position. Here was a guy who said bluntly, I fight for the working man, the working woman, not for the masters of capital.
Right. So
it's inconvenient to have that in our history.
That's very and that person ascended to the vice presidency and was, for a period of time, the obvious successor to the most popular president and most successful president of the 20th century. Yeah, that's inconvenient. So can you we'll get this moving forward, but because you obviously trace this through, the post-Wallace history of the Democratic Party up till today, but can you talk a little bit more about the different factions in the New Deal and the ones, obviously he angered the bankers, he angered the segregationists. I'm curious also, though, about the relationship with the city bosses. And then conversely, because I don't want this to get written out either, what was his relationship with these incredible forces inside the New Deal and pushing it along, like someone like A. Philip Randolph, who I think is another person that we better start to learn about A. Philip Randolph if we want to figure anything out. So how did he fit? And I guess, was there something specific about this Midwest prairie populism that maybe even went back to the 1850s in Europe and migrations from people who had struggled as trade unionists in places like Germany and brought that politics to the Dakotas and Wisconsin and so on?
You sum up a lot of the right things here, and you're seeing the streams. In fact, in the book, if there's a second star of the book, the book is not just about Henry Wallace. It traces history from the 40s right up to the present. It closes in 2019. But if there is another star there, it's A. Philip Randolph. He figures repeatedly in the book. And A. Philip Randolph was the radical socialist organizer who became head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was the African-American leader who broke through into an influential position in the AFL and ultimately the AFL-CIO. And yet he never bent. He kept an incredible movement vision. If you had a Democratic president, he pressured that president. If you had a Republican president, he pressured that president. His vision was essentially that he was there to push forward the trade union movement, to push forward racial justice, and to push forward economic justice. And so he was a remarkable figure. Now, the reason I give that kind of lengthier reference to A. Philip Randolph, who's a huge hero of mine, is because when Randolph was pressuring from the outside, he had friends on the inside. And Eleanor Roosevelt was always there, and she was an incredibly significant figure, clearly an ally of the left on many, many issues. Right. And Henry Wallace, the same. In fact, the best way to understand Wallace's relationship to movements is that in this very factionalized team of rivals White House, Wallace was a go-to person for civil rights campaigners, for trade unionists, for women's rights campaigners, and for dedicated anti-fascists, for people who were absolutely committed to fighting fascism abroad. And it was the vital struggle of his era as vice president, but who also recognize the roots of fascism, to speak about it in blunt terms, and to talk about what he again referred to as an Americanized fascism, those who would divide along race, class, gender, religion. And so he was there as an ally. Now, the factions were very strong, and they succeeded in 1943 in marginalizing Wallace within the administration. He was leading a lot of the war effort and doing very, very well. But he did things like saying, well, we have to pay the workers in other countries who are producing rubber for America a fair wage. We can't exploit them. And there were bankers in the administration, money types, who were like, what the hell are you talking about? And he was saying the same about American workers. And so they really did drive a wedge. And he was forced out of some of the positions he had in the administration, not all of them. And he did a fascinating thing. In the summer of 1943, he said, okay, I've got a little more time on my hands. I'm going to travel across America, and I'm going to meet with the disenfranchised, sometimes marginalized groups and activists and give voice to what they are doing. So if you can imagine this, a sitting vice president of the United States met with Latino farm workers, met with African-American civil rights campaigners, met with Jewish people fighting against anti-Semitism abroad and in the United States, met with women to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment and other issues. And he brought this all back to the White House. And there's no question that Roosevelt listened to him. And so he had a huge influence there. He used the platform that he had to do an inside-outside politics. Now, this worked quite well with Roosevelt. There's no question. Their relationship remained relatively strong. It would have its up and downs, but it also infuriated the big city bosses who wanted to control progress, right? The big city bosses weren't always against progress, but they definitely wanted to manage it for their own interests. It went over horribly with Southern segregationists because he was bluntly calling out racism. It went over terribly with the bankers and the money folks because he really was talking about re-upping the New Deal in a fundamental way at the end of World War II. And frankly, it went over horribly with people like Winston Churchill, because Winston Churchill, one of the best allies, top allies of the U.S. at the time, was deeply offended that in 1943, 1944, Wallace was writing pamphlets saying that in the post-war era, the United States must oppose imperialism and colonialism. So he at once stirred up a lot of good trouble, but he also made a lot of enemies, and they came for him.
When you're right about everything, you piss everybody off. So yeah, right. Sometimes. So then take us through basically, I guess, after the Democratic Party in different phases. And let's talk about the 50s and 60s first, because obviously the 70s and 80s is more where we get to this full sort of third way politics that we're still with today. But the very interesting thing, as far as the breakup of the coalition, particularly in the 60s, where you're continuing to have some real genuine domestic achievement and progress that's responding to the enormous pressure of still Philip Randolph and labor civil rights pushes, and also emerging like women's movements and environment and so on. Obviously, then you have the colonial genocidal war in Vietnam, I'll call it. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could use an idea that I think also comes from World War II. It may even have been Randolph too, but the idea of a double V, that the double victory, the defeat of fascism abroad, defeat of fascism in the form of Jim Crow and other forms of brutality at home. We know obviously there was great progress in the New Deal, but again, segregationists, apartheidists were still part of the coalition. In the 60s, it flipped, where there really was this enormous achievements domestically, but then the acceleration again of a kind of neo-colonial foreign policy. I mean, is that how you'd see the split happening? Maybe
absolutely that. Yeah, you know your history very well.
I read you.
I don't have to tell you that. The Double V campaign is one of the great, historic efforts. I write about it in the book.
Yep.
One of the things I try to do in the book is to constantly keep an eye on the movements, and how movements were changing politics and who was open to that and who was closed to that. To my mind, that's really what the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party is about. It's not just a left and a right. It's not just visionaries versus status quo types. It's also who keeps the door open, who says, hey, there's people marching. Let's listen to them. Let's draw in what they're doing. They're building new power. They're building new movements. Let's respect that. Wallace believed that with a great passion. He also believed very, very strongly that there were two issues that needed focus. One was peace. He believed that efforts should be made to achieve peace, to make sure that you would not have wars, that you would not have militarism, imperialism, colonialism, all of these issues, kind of getting in the way of a domestic agenda. And he believed these things would be in conflict constantly. And so his argument was that the way to make great progress at home was to also bend hard to achieve peace internationally. Now that could be frustrating, and Wallace got in trouble for that quite often because there were people who said he was so much for peace that he didn't anticipate, he didn't understand the Soviet threat, that he didn't anticipate, he didn't understand the challenges of undoing colonialism, that he didn't anticipate, that he didn't understand what would become the Cold War. I would argue in reading his diaries and reading what he wrote about that he anticipated it very well. He understood it, and he believed, this is the great divide, he believed the United States could, by example and with diplomacy and with smart coalition building around the world, create an alternative that was so appealing that the U.S. would in fact be a great leader in the world, but it wouldn't be a leader just based on military might. It would also have a vision. And so he fought for that. And he argued if you didn't do that, if you didn't always keep an eye on these two tracks, on achieving peace and on achieving, and this is the other side, domestic progress that had to address fundamental domestic issues. And that was racism, sexism, class divides. One or the other would interrupt, they would always kind of be pulling on each other. And we can sum it up by saying that in the 1950s, when he was pushed aside by Democrats, when Democrats were very, didn't want to be around him because he had broken with the party on fundamental issues. The interesting thing is that he maintained a correspondence with Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower clearly had, Eisenhower and Eisenhower's brother, Milton, who was very influential, clearly had high regard for Wallace. They wrote letters, they took counsel, they exchanged ideas. And it got to the point where in 1956, Wallace endorsed Eisenhower over Stevenson. And his argument for that was he believed Eisenhower was more committed to achieving peace, and also that Eisenhower got the need to address racial divisions. And interestingly enough, he was not alone in that. Adam Clayton Powell, the leading African-American member of Congress at the time, also endorsed Eisenhower in 1956. So if we understand the churn at that time, there was still a fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was not where it needed to be. And so it felt pressures all over the place. Fast forward to the 1960s, A. Philip Randolph and others, profoundly influential, the civil rights movement, moving the Democratic Party to the left. And then the amazing reality that Randolph and King developed the Freedom Budget, which in 1966, in that area, they were in the White House talking about basically bringing the Economic Bill of Rights to reality. And Johnson was listening, and other people were listening, John Gardner and people like that. So things were happening, and then Vietnam. And you cannot, it almost proves the whole concept here, that you can start to get great social progress at home, and then you end up with a war that draws down your budget. And they were saying that, well, we don't have the money for these initiatives at home. I write a lot about it in the book, actually. We don't have money for initiatives at home because we've got this big war on our hands. And if I can just throw one more Wallace element into it, Henry Wallace hoped to live to be 100 years old. He didn't make it. He developed a very serious physical ailment. And in his last days, when he was in his mid to late 70s, he could not speak anymore. In 1965, he communicated with a tablet. He would write things out. And one of the last messages he wrote was that what was happening in Vietnam would destroy all of the progress that they were achieving. And so to the very end, he saw these fundamental realities. And the reason I wrote the book is not to make Wallace into a perfect hero. He made plenty of mistakes. He had flaws. He acknowledged those flaws. But it is to say that we had people along the way who told us where the fault lines were, where the crises were, where the critical junctures were. And they were marginalized. And I think they were marginalized at great cost to the Democratic Party and at great cost to America.
Absolutely. So then what happens in, let's just take the 70s, 80s through Clinton. How does then it start to, basically, I mean, I guess across the board shift to the right, but Matt Stoller had a very interesting piece a couple of years ago where he actually talked about the kind of first phase in the 70s as a decoupling from the the movement against the war in Vietnam, obviously, and some of the kind of social liberalism, not in terms of policy. I think it's important to really start to distinguish those things, but the counterculture more broadly and how that would kind of enforce politics, and people emerging like Jerry Brown. The point of his piece, I'm forgetting the name of it though, is that that some of these people came in with, a good understanding around Vietnam, but actually not much about antitrust legislation at all, and no concern, a total conflation with some of the stagnation, and contradictions and failings of the New Deal with a wholesale rejection of these, massive accomplishments that they'd achieved. And I'm just wondering, and maybe, McGovern and how his relationship with some of the labor unions plays into that. But I guess, what's the next phase that happens here where this starts the Democratic Party starts to move fully to, I guess, what we would call neoliberalism now?
Well, you're tracking it perfectly. And this is.
I told you I read you. So
yeah, well, it's not me. It's Matt. Like reading Matt and other good people.
Yes, right.
But the book actually tracks right through this. And the argument I would make is that in the mid to late 1960s, people had no idea how incredibly powerful movements were, and these were movements of the left. It didn't mean that they necessarily won every fight, but it meant that they were in the game, and they were multiracial. The word, Kimberly Crenshaw had not given us the word, but they were intersectional. They often understood race, gender, class, the need to pull these issues together. There was a critique of corporate power. It wasn't as strong as perhaps some people might have liked it to be, but it was there. Remember, SDS and what Tom Hayden and other people did, they understood corporate power. They understood it quite well. And so this was all in the mix. I would also add, by the way, that A. Philip Randolph and many of the civil rights campaigners really understood corporate power and really understood the need to link economic justice with racial justice. And so they pushed this. So that it was there. It was alive. It was linked to a massive anti-war movement. And frankly, we lose sight. It was linked to a massive environmental movement that around Earth Day 1970 was huge. And so just as in the 1940s, power became terrified of what Henry Wallace and others like him, A. Philip Randolph and others, were pulling together, so again, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, power became terrified. So imagine this, just within the Democratic Party. In 1968, the leading vote getter in the primaries they had, and they didn't have as many primaries then, was Eugene McCarthy. He got 38% of the vote nationally. The number two vote getter was Bobby Kennedy, who got 31% of the vote. And then, you had some independent African-American candidates in some other places, or African-American leaders in places like DC, who also were getting substantial numbers of votes for an anti-war, civil rights, social justice agenda. And so when you pull all of these components together, you can say without a question that, the anti-war movement in those primaries, in that process of choosing a Democratic nominee in 68, it got around 70, 75% of the vote. Hubert Humphrey got 2% of the vote in the primaries. Hubert Humphrey got nominated and he lost. Right. The polls show that had they nominated McCarthy, he was well ahead of Nixon. And so there the party chose its status quo. It chose not to embrace movements. It chose not to go forward, and it crumbled and at a critical point. And now the movements continued. And so 1970, who do you see getting elected to Congress, beating Democratic incumbents? Ron Dellums, a radical out of Oakland and Berkeley. Bella Abzug, a radical out of New York City. 2 years later, Elizabeth Holtzman beating, one of the senior Democrats in Congress. I mean, these movements continued, and they continued both in the streets, but also to try and fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. 72, a grassroots movement taking advantage of changes in rules, nominates George McGovern for president of the United States. He is backed by a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition. It is quite remarkable what McGovern did. And immediately after he's nominated, elites in the Democratic Party, a huge number, we're talking about former cabinet secretaries, governors, senators, members of Congress, mayors around the country, formed Democrats for Nixon. They actively campaigned, buying full-page ads in newspapers, TV, radio, against their nominee, because their nominee was trying to move them forward, right? So you saw this incredible battle along the way for the soul of the Democratic Party, with the establishment power not giving up an inch. I mean, fighting as hard as it could. And I read all about this in the book, how these battles go back and forth, and it's a tremendous struggle.
I guess yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I just say ultimately, the neoliberals, the corporatists, were always looking for a way in, a way to do it. They changed rules. They canceled midterm conferences. They created super delegates. They began to open the flood of money into the party. And I would argue that last thing, opening the flood of money into the party, really tipped the balance for a substantial period of time, through the 80s into the 90s, toward really a stark neoliberalism. And it was, at that period, it can be safely said that for a substantial period of time, the soul of the Democratic Party was lost.
I think the big concern too is how did some of these same trajectory, that in parallel to this process, that labor unions started to get blamed for Vietnam and bashed for McGovern, and so this demonizing of the really important and positive legacies of the New Deal, of the Great Society, that were right and correct in terms of economic policies, and basically, if you understood, A. Philip Randolph's agenda was, we're going to get rid of American apartheid and we're going to have a social democracy for everybody.
That's right.
I mean, that's I think basically still the thing, that if you have the kind of politics we have, you're still fighting against a multitude of forces today, because you have to fight against the brutality and the xenophobia and everything else, the Republican Party. You have to fight against the, woke nonsense neoliberals. And in the 90s, you had to fight against the Clinton Democrats. So I guess I want to just, speak to that too, because somehow it seems like this class that came in the 70s in Congress, that some of them were great and they kind of became important, almost like gadfly kind of figures. Like Dellums was, he would put out a peace budget in the 80s and it was great and it was cool, but he didn't have much, power in the Democratic Party. And then, some of these other folks came in with, a certain kind of liberalism and anti-Vietnam sentiment. But by the time you get to the 90s, they had made their peace with foreign interventions. And all along the way, they were actually very comfortable with attacking New Deal and Great Society programs and kind of embracing Reagan economics. And maybe even Joe Biden kind of comes in here, because he would be kind of part of that class.
Well, he certainly was at periods along the way.
Yeah.
That's a terrific question, because it gets to the real kind of heart and soul struggles that took place. And a lot of my book is devoted to that period. And there are many heroes, right? Plenty of villains, but many heroes. Jesse Jackson fought against this whole thing. When they formed the Democratic Leadership Council, which was the neoliberal force that Clinton and others were associated with. Jesse Jackson called them Democrats for the leisure class. And he continued to put forward a vision of economic and social and racial justice that was deeply linked to peace and that was deeply linked to environmental concerns. And here's the interesting thing about, again, how the Democratic Party, by closing its door, right, by pulling in rather than being open to movements, here they had this amazing thing. The Rainbow Coalition came into being. And what anticipated the future more than the Rainbow Coalition, right? This idea of, this multiracial coalition that brought trade unionists and civil rights campaigners and women's rights campaigners and LGBTQ community folks that reached out to Arab Americans and said, you too can be a part of these coalitions. This was big deal stuff. And in 1988, no less a figure than Johnny Apple, the great New York Times writer, and others, many good writers at that time, said the dynamism of the 88 campaign was Jackson. He was the guy who really excited people. He didn't get the nomination. And my book is not about winners always. A lot of people I write about lost, but they didn't lose because their ideas were bad. They lost because structural challenges were in their way. And the interesting part was that in 88, Jackson gave what was arguably the best speech ever at a Democratic National Convention. I would argue his speech to that convention was miraculous. It was amazing. I invite people to go back and listen to it. And it was electric. And what did they do? They turned around and said, oh, well, hey, thanks a lot. And by the way, instead of you, the guy who came in second, very strong, young, dynamic figure with a lot of following, who really could expand the base of the party, being thought about as vice presidential candidate, we're going to choose Lloyd Bentsen, the senator closest to bankers, a guy who literally had spent his life fighting against and defeating progressives in Texas. We're going to make him the vice president because that's going to be how we win the South, right? This whole concept. Well, what did they do? They lost Texas and every southern state, right? But they also lost California and Vermont and all sorts of states that would quickly become very liberal places. And in the book, I asked the question, I ran the numbers. What if you put Jesse Jackson on the ticket in 88? You might not have won, but these narrow defeats they had in all sorts of states across the country, I think a very good chance they would have prevailed and you would have had a different course for the Democratic Party. The tragedy of it is that I think there are people who at that period were involved in the Democratic Party who were more willing to lose than to give up control of one of the two political parties for purposes of their status quo vision, their maintenance of a conservative, frankly, an economically conservative, neoliberal, and often neoconservative vision. And
we have to get to where we are today in a second, because I think a lot of people are saying, right, exactly. As we come out of this new primary experience. But before we get there, we got to go back to 1948. Was it Henry Wallace ran as an independent?
He ran as a third-party candidate. He and his allies created what was called the New Party. It became to be known as the Progressive Party.
And in 2000, not the same level of stature, but Ralph Nader, very important American figure, very high stature person, very serious person, runs, as the Green Party. And both of these to me from, if you're looking at it from the left, obviously Ross Perot ran a very serious campaign.
Helps to be a billionaire.
It helps to be a billionaire, and it helps to not have a left-wing message, and you can get a lot of novelty press coverage that way. But these were the two serious left-wing third-party candidacies, and I think Ralph Nader got about 3% nationally. Wallace got you said 3 million votes or so.
2 million.
2 million. Sorry,
actually, no, lower than that. I take it back. Wallace's 48 campaign crashed and burned.
So what's the less? I don't want to just do a kind of morality tale about people voting third party or whatever, but I'm actually concerned strategically about this. One, I don't make any secret. I believe in tactical voting and lesser of two evils and all of that. I've never been convinced otherwise, so people know that. But even more fundamentally, the work that has been done by Bernie to bring things like Medicare for All back on the agenda, I don't think are served by getting 500,000 votes nationally for some kind of third party thing. So anyways, that's my bias. But what is the lesson about the structural barriers to third party politics that we have from two, I'm sure there's going to be some great people running third party, but they're not the former vice president of the United States, and they are not the most prominent consumer advocate, regulatory activist of the 70s and 80s. And they couldn't do it in any real way. So what's the lesson here?
The lesson is this. Let me preface it by saying I don't tell people what to do politically. Honestly, I think people have their journeys, and they may determine. I actually write about this in the book. They may determine at a certain point that they want to do a third party fight. And the fact is that if you look back at some of the third party fights of the 1840s, where people said there's no place in these major parties for an opponent of slavery.
Right.
And so I'm going to do a third party run, James Burney being an example. He didn't get a lot of votes, but boy, and when I look at it historically, I think I like him. I think I like the person that did that. And similarly, in 1924, when Robert M. La Follette broke with the Republican Party and ran with the support of independents and socialists on a third party run, saying that both the Democratic and the Republican Party were too much in the sway of the Ku Klux Klan and too influenced by Wall Street and military industrial complex. So I respect people who take the journey that where they choose to go in the moment they do. And history will sometimes reward them, sometimes punish. But what I will tell you is you get to the heart of the matter when you talk about structural barriers. And I write a lot about that in the book. In 1948, when Henry Wallace ran for president as an independent progressive, he did put together quite a coalition. It was he was backed by Albert Einstein and Frank Lloyd Wright and Paul Robeson and a young Harry Belafonte, and a whole host of women's rights activists who went on to become prominent figures in America. When you look at the people that backed him in 48. It was pretty amazing. But this was an intellectual left, largely. Some activists. Right. No question of that there were some very good activists on the ground around the country. He accepted the support of communists at a time when the Red Scare was rising. He was not a communist. In fact, he was a very successful businessman. But he believed that you could have a broad popular front coalition and, still govern effectively. He hated the idea of the Red Scare and called it out quite bluntly. So here's where he was. He was running this campaign. Early polls showed him doing quite well. He got on the ballots, not everywhere, but most places. And then you can just see it happen. In the fall of 1948, the media, and this is separate from structural barriers of hard to get on ballots, hard to get in debates, all these things that we also talk about. I mean, it was savage. They brought out every criticism you can imagine of Wallace. They called him a spiritualist, right? Or they said he followed gurus because he was interested in
communist who follows gurus. This is my guy.
Yeah. Well, they also they literally attacked him for being in good shape, physically good shape, because he played tennis and stuff like that. And
he's awesome. I love this guy.
He played with boomerangs, which at the time were like the frisbee of the moment. And they ridiculed him for this. He said he's a 60-year-old man who's in good shape. What the hell's wrong with him? And so when you put all the pieces together, they called him a dupe of the communists. They called him a dupe of everybody. It was just daily brutal attacks. Now he had brought some of it on himself. I'm not I don't try to write and say Wallace was perfect, but the fact of the matter is you cannot believe how they unloaded on him. There were literally, I have some in the book, there were literally newspaper editorials that said, hey, don't, this is the responsible position of the, kind of newspaper editorialists. Don't throw eggs at Wallace. Don't attack him physically. Just vote against him. That's the responsible position.
Right.
And Truman fed into this and gamed it. And at the end of the day, it failed terribly. Beautiful components of it. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that Wallace and Pete Seeger and Paul Robeson and others went to the American South in the midst of American apartheid, literally deep segregation and Jim Crow, and they campaigned at multiracial rallies. Wallace refused to sleep in hotels that weren't integrated. He refused to hold rallies in rooms that weren't integrated. His vice presidential candidate, Glenn Taylor, was arrested by Bull Connor in Alabama for walking in a door that was marked non-whites, because Glenn Taylor, the vice presidential candidate, a U.S. senator at the time, said he would not, participate in the Jim Crow policies. So, I mean, important things that they did in that fight, but yet it failed. And in the book, I read a lot about a side group that's almost lost to history, and this was called Democrats for Wallace. And there was a group of people who argued in 48 that he should have fought his fight in the Democratic Party, even though he might well have lost to Truman, that he could have built out a fighting force within the party that would be an ongoing base for the left, and that ultimately would get further. Now, responsible people argue both sides. Similarly with Nader in 2000, right? You have all the arguments. What I will say is this: my looking at these things comes to a conclusion that, again, where people want to go, they should go. You must follow your vision. If somebody could talk you out of your visions or your passions in your journey, that's another thing altogether. But for those who want to fight in the Democratic Party, for those who choose to do so, what they have to understand is that it's an ongoing fight, and you will have setbacks, severe setbacks. You'll have glorious moments and great breakthroughs, but then you will have, deep setbacks, and you just keep fighting on. You build it out, you get better, you run one campaign, figure something out, and run the next. And you look at the times. Remember, how did we break through on civil rights? You say, oh, the Democratic Party backed civil rights. Well, back in 1964, Republicans were actually a lot of Republicans were very good on civil rights as well. But what was really happening was the movements were so big. 1970, 71. Say, well, some Republicans were really good environmentalists, a lot of Democrats, but the movements were really big. I would argue that we are now at a moment today with the coronavirus pandemic, with mass unemployment, with all the challenges we face, and with a planet that is in crisis, physical crisis, that we have a moment where a visionary politics has tremendous potential. There may be setbacks, but to give up on trying, to give up on fighting, be it inside or outside, I think it's just not acceptable. You don't get to do that. You don't get to give up. Now, again, people may choose their different routes, but if you are going to fight in the Democratic Party, people should understand they're in a fight. They should understand that the status quo, that political elites, political establishment has always existed, that it's very small, that it's, related to money, related to power, and that it will always be there. It will fight as hard as it can. It will often prevail. It will have many allies. This power will have many allies in the media. And once you recognize that fight, that it really is a fight for the soul of a party, then you fight harder. You push harder, and you don't blink. And I'm not accusing anybody of blinking. I'm just saying, now going forward, it should be a clear-eyed, clear understanding that these fights are really about whether we are going to have a functional future, and frankly, whether we're going to have a planet.
So final question then, and thank you so much for your time, and please everybody read this book. It's just such a great book. I agree with everything you're saying, but I definitely think, what just happened to Bernie is a significant, major defeat, and it's seriously bad news for the United States. It's bad news, arguably globally. And I think in some ways now is about holding whatever line you can hold for as long as possible while there's work put into primarily reviving trade unionism and whatever else. And that's kind of my view. So, I'm like you vote for the Democrat over the Republican because of marginally better National Labor Relations Board appointments, and a court system that won't potentially outlaw union organizing, right? I mean, this is very basic stuff and the really obvious reasons to vote practically in my mind. But on the other hand, I'm not into, I think the idea that, I want people to have the fight, and I'm actually particularly interested in what someone like Sherrod Brown is going to do right now, because, for what it's worth, he represents a major state, not just somebody who, has good politics, but represents a safe blue district that really does not have the same, power incentive to be brought to bear. So, but that being said, I think these task forces are window dressing. I think Joe Biden is absolutely a product of any number of terrible political traditions. I think his core, I guess Ted Kaufman's there, and Ted Kaufman, when he was a senator for 2 years, was actually great on some banking and financial issues. So I'll give him credit where credit is due. But, we're seeing the lists. We're seeing, Bloomberg and Jamie Dimon and everybody else. And I think that's the presidency and the leadership Joe Biden represents 100%. And so, I'm holding these two positions of, it's a big loss. There's no progress right now. And at the same time, of course, getting Donald Trump out of office is a no-brainer and obvious and important. But, I know that you actually have a little bit of a different read on these task forces and what's taking place. And I'd like you to see if you could cheer me and everybody else up.
Well, I've sometimes been accused of being an optimist, so watch out.
We need that.
Well, a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
My friend Rebecca Solnit always says, be careful about optimism. What you really want to believe in is hope. And hope isn't naive. It says the fight's as big as you imagine, but that you still hope for the right result. And then you work toward it. So here's the heart of the matter. I think that within the Democratic Party, I'm not sure the left has always understood just how well organized the corporate forces are. But I think there's a dawning recognition of that. And I think, frankly, Bernie Sanders' 2016 and 2020 campaigns really helped to bring that into focus, along with a whole host of other issues, vital issues as regards, just think of what's on the table now in a fundamental way. We are talking about Medicare for all. We are talking about, give Andrew Yang some credit for this. We're talking about some guaranteed income ideas. We are talking about criminal justice reform that might actually mean something. We just had a big victory out in Portland, Oregon for a district attorney candidate who backs criminal justice reform. So we're seeing this, we're seeing the issues shift. We're seeing the possibilities open up. And yeah, there are going to be setbacks along that way. Can you imagine, having been a anti-slavery campaigner from 1800 to 1860? What frustrations, what deep disappointments along the way, and yet you carry forward, right? And the interesting thing was that many of these folks moved between different camps and different political options because they were just trying, what's the best way forward? How do we get there? How do we achieve something? They ultimately formed a political party, the Republicans. And so if you understand it as a long-term struggle, right, then you seize every opportunity that you're given, every opening that exists. And that's why I argue for the task forces, not because I disagree with the concept that they're window dressing. They are unquestionably developed to be window dressing. So here's the interesting question. Who makes the window dressing, right? Who, what window dressing is, right? It's like things you put in the window, right? Or, it's like, who makes it? Who produces it? Well, if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Stephanie Kelton and Sarah Nelson and a whole bunch of other people, Karen Bass, who I actually have quite a bit of respect for as a really significant figure coming out of community organizing in California. John Kerry, who frankly on environmental issues has been quite a bit better than a lot of Democrats in all these different positions, some Biden appointees, some Sanders appointees. I'm just going to say, let's give it a go. Let's try for everything we can. Remember that there's a representative of the Sunrise Movement on the climate task force. she has already made it very clear that she intends to fight, that she intends to make this an inside-outside struggle. So my argument is that an opening has been created. It's a mistake to think that the platform committee is going to be as significant as it was in some previous moments, I think. I think these task forces effectively have become what will be the platform committee. And I think that there is an opportunity there to draw out a vision and to push it. And frankly, to push Joe Biden. I would use it. And here's the interesting thing, Michael. I wouldn't use it just to have a fight, although fights are fun and they're appropriate. I would use it to deliver a message that Joe Biden is in many ways an accidental nominee. He got a lucky break in the primary schedule. He had tremendous media cheerleading. He had, some things come together at critical points. He's very likely going to be the nominee. But unless he is a complete fool, he has to understand that this didn't come because he's got a great message. It didn't come because he's a dynamic campaigner. It didn't come because he's got a great organization. He had some things in his favor, but he was actually very lucky to get to where he's at. And now to get through November in a way that matters for him, he desperately needs to change, to get better, to understand the dynamics that are required. It isn't just to win the election. He may well win the election, but you know what really worries me, Michael? 2022. Because if Joe Biden comes in with a narrow win and does not govern with a full-on New Deal dynamism, something that really excites people and builds out coalitions and builds loyalty, then something interesting is going to happen, I would predict. And it's the nightmare of the Democratic Party in the modern era. Understand this. Let me just give you quickly. They pushed Wallace aside in 44. They put Truman in. In 46, they lost the Congress, right? They won power in 44, but then in 46 lost it at that critical stage. What came out of that? Taft-Hartley, the undermining of the labor movement, fundamental, horrible shifts. Okay, let's keep on going forward. Bill Clinton, right, brings the Jimmy Carter brings the Democratic Party back in 76, right? But in 78, massive setbacks in Congress, unable to really govern as effectively as he wants. 92, Bill Clinton gets elected, right? He has the House and Senate. 94, terrible setbacks, right? And really disempowered, moves to a hard neoliberal position. 2008, Barack Obama, an incredible victory, wins the presidency by a large margin, wins the House and the Senate. 2010, massive setbacks in congressional elections, undermines his ability to govern going forward. The bottom line is this: how you govern when you get power matters fundamentally. And the only way to make Joe Biden govern in a way that will be good for Joe Biden and his party, frankly, is to put enormous pressure on him now and to actually communicate with him logically that he has to move to a more progressive position. So yes, I would use the task forces. I'd use whatever vehicle is available. And frankly, I would use history, because the history is very, very clear on this. When the Democratic Party governs with a progressive, visionary, forward-looking vision, it tends to do very, very well, and it tends to hold its power in advance. When it doesn't do so, the modern history certainly is of a real struggle to hold on to that power and to do something meaningful. And Michael, we can't afford it anymore. We don't have another presidency to waste. Brother, I'm not here.
You're muted, Michael.
Apologies. I was muted because there was something really loud outside. I apologize. But John, I was just saying thank you so much. Really appreciate it. As always, the book is The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, The Enduring Legacy of Henry Wallace's Anti-Fascist, Anti-Racist Politics. Grab it. Get a little dose of optimism, but most importantly, ground yourself in history. That really is, regardless of where you come down on these things, that is the number one thing. No future without a past. John, thanks so much for doing this.
I'm really honored to join you. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you so much. Stay safe. Be well.
You too.
All right, guys. I guess we're going to get ready to go into the fun half. Got some stories, got some sound. Become a member of the Majority Report today, majority.fm/become a member. Go to patreon.com/TMBS to become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show. We had a really fun show on Tuesday. I'd go watch it on YouTube. Had the Woke Bros on, Wozni Lambre and Nando Vila. Talked about tracing a third way. Is there a way to have a democratic internet that is not Silicon Valley platform capitalism or the Chinese model of mass surveillance? These are really important questions in the sort of history of the battle of the internet. Product of the military industrial. Yeah.
We also talked about the bulls.
We talked about the bulls for about 25 minutes. That was really, we played a hilarious clip of Stacey Abrams realizing she's not going to be vice president, which is one of the funniest things I've seen in quite some time. And a whole lot of other things. This weekend, an illicit history of the idea of claps and public relations from Russia to 2020 today with Mark Ames, which I'm super stoked about. Patreon.com/TMBS. And of course, Red Emma's is restacked with copies of Against the Web, Cosmopolitan Answer to New Right. So I really appreciate everybody. That book is selling very well, and it's a big help to our friends over at Red Emma's. Also, if for whatever reason you have trouble with that, go to IndieBound, and you can put in your zip code, and you can buy books. This is a great way to buy books in general, because you should never buy books from Amazon. Go to IndieBound if you're buying books to buy your books, including Against the Web. All right, let's keep it moving. Jamie, what's up?
Hey, so this week on the Anti-Fada, I had a pretty chill episode with my friend Heather Fortune, returning guest, musician, leftist shit poster, queen. We talked about a little bit about the Elon Musk and Grimes baby. We talked about our cats. We talked about being horny in the choir. And we talked about the great new album from Fiona Apple, which we both really love a lot. So if you enjoy the vibe on a casual Friday where like Sam's just talking to one of his friends on the phone about shit, you'll probably enjoy this too. But, you know, swap out Sam and some actor friend for like me and fellow goth socialist. Also on Friday, that's tomorrow, we are releasing a new episode of Prolet Cult, wherein our published author now, AP Andy, talks about UFOs, conspiracy theories, and the parapolitical. So check that out. That's coming out for patrons tomorrow. Patreon.com.
Congratulations, Andy. Matt.
Yeah, over at twitch.tv/literary hangover, you can subscribe. Yesterday afternoon, it was nice. We had a short show, so I got on and played Metro Exodus, which is set in Moscow, to Yevgeny Zamyatin's 1924 novel, We, which inspired Brave New World and 1984. So check that out, folks. Twitch.tv/literary hangover.
That is deeply awesome. All right, folks, we are going to take a break. We will see you on the fun half.
Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous, you're a little bit upset, you're riled up.
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude, you want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
That's a good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 238 56, 27, 1/2, 5/8, 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy!
Dance, dance, dance.
Rand Paul.
I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook. Throw our hands up.
Ooh.
Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey, shut up!
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
Welcome to the fun half, everybody here. Let's see. Let's go to a piece of sound right out of the gate. President Lula was on PBS's NewsHour last night. And this is interesting because, I mean, basically, there's a whole process that I've talked about, and please look up both the interview I did with him and the coverage overall of this Lava Jato task force backed by the DOJ, this political warfare that made him a political prisoner and paved the way for Bolsonaro, included not only was the press complicit, much of the press cheerleaded it on. And I don't know about PBS's coverage specifically, but I do know that everybody from the New York Times to the Guardian had just awful coverage with regards to this. Bolsonaro is so uniquely reckless. I mean, obviously he parallels Trump and the Republicans, but Brazil has more cases, I think, than the rest of Latin America combined. Now, obviously part of that is population, but also it is just it's people in really close living conditions, like in favelas. It's indigenous communities getting exposed to, I mean, exposure to any kind of novel virus for them would be particularly dangerous, let alone corona that's dangerous for everybody. And Jair Bolsonaro is firing health ministers for talking about social distancing. He's putting out videos, and I have mixed feelings about some of this in general, but I mean, he's a head of state who's getting videos pulled from social media platforms for giving misinformation. I think the extremeness of how ridiculous it is, combined with the revelations about the corruption of Lava Jato, are allowing Lula to be treated a fraction of what he should be treated like, which is as a incredibly important and respected elder statesman. Anyways, here he is on the NewsHour with just yesterday on PBS talking about the coronavirus in Brazil.
Late last week.
In late 2019, former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known widely just as Lula, walked out of prison after 580 days and stepped right back onto the political stage.
Today, I'm a guy that doesn't have a job, a president without a pension, not even a television in my apartment. My life is totally blocked. The only thing I'm certain of is that I have more courage to fight than before.
His top targets? The current president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, and his allies, who Lula claims wrongfully convicted him of corruption in 2017, a conviction he's now appealing. Today, the focus of Lula's criticism is Bolsonaro's mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic.
We have an invisible enemy which we do not know. We do not have the medication to cure it. And many leaders, such as the president of Brazil and the president of the U.S., are not treating it seriously with the necessary precautions to face the pandemic.
To date, more than 18,000 Brazilians have died of COVID-19, and the virus is running rampant through vulnerable communities, the sprawling, crowded urban areas known as favelas, and among indigenous communities in the Amazon and other remote regions. The death toll in Latin America's largest country is now the 6th worst in the world. The total number of infections ranks 3rd globally. But experts believe the government is likely vastly underreporting the number of cases and fear what will follow. Do you believe that Brazil will become the next global epicenter for this pandemic?
I think Brazil runs the risk of becoming the next epicenter of the pandemic. The country alone has more people contaminated and deaths than all of South America. The problem we have in Brazil, and this is my present concern, is that the pandemic is beginning to reach the poorest places and peripheries throughout the country.
Like President Trump, President Bolsonaro downplayed early concerns over the virus. He clashed with health officials, firing his first health minister, who criticized his approach. His second health minister stepped down after just 1 month on the job. And he's peddled misinformation, leading both Facebook and Twitter to remove his posts saying the drug hydroxychloroquine was, quote, working in all places. Bolsonaro, who's so far been unable to make good on his promise to fix a faltering economy, has also pushed for Brazilian businesses to reopen, mimicking President Trump's message.
People are dying. They are. I'm sorry, but more will die. Much, much more, if the economy continues to be destroyed by those measures.
And just like Trump supporters, Bolsonaro's backers have taken to the streets in defiance of local social distancing orders.
President Bolsonaro likes to copy to repeat President Trump's actions. That is, President Bolsonaro believes President Trump is a higher being, so he simply copies everything Trump says. And Bolsonaro does not discuss the pandemic. He discusses any topic. He offends the Supreme Court, native indigenous peoples, blacks, women, Congress, Senate, the opposition, governors, mayors, but he does not take care of the pandemic.
In recent weeks, though, Lula has escalated his attacks.
And it goes on to talk about how Lula is now trying to strategize getting Bolsonaro impeached. But I just like that part where he's like, thinks of Trump as a higher being. He in a previous interview, he called Bolsonaro. He's like, Trump's just rich Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro likes him because he's rich. Like he's very good at specifically disrespecting and unmanning Bolsonaro, which I know, and especially when it's on an American outlet, freaks Bolsonaro and his allies out. But there's parallels between the US and the UK, but I mean, people really need to look at like the Americas as a political bloc, because this Republican stuff is not only a product, obviously, of traditional U.S. interference and support by right-wing parties, but things like the Atlas Network, which the Koch brothers funded to push extreme libertarian stuff across Latin America. And it's coming home to roost, of course, because, you have essentially Trump and a Republican governor presiding over Brazil, and it's a catastrophe. Yeah,
it's almost like we're in a global fight against a common enemy.
Yeah, fascists. It's very easy to just minimize fascists by relation because they're so hierarchy focused. So all of a sudden you say, yeah, you're a wannabe Trump. I mean, some people probably think that's cool in Brazil, but
he knows how to. It's good disrespect.
Yeah,
it's good disrespect, and the tenor of it just used to be reported, oh, he's just convicted of corruption. Nobody would mention, at the very least, that it was highly disputed, let alone that there was never any material evidence that it was clearly a political operation. So the whole way in which that's being presented on a U.S. mainstream news outlet is changing significantly. Sort of like how in a couple of years, Netflix or somebody will do some documentary on how horrible. Yeah, maybe. Well, they kind of did that with the great Petra Costa one, but I'm thinking, in Bolivia will be the next one. They'll do in a year. So everybody will be like, oh my God, that was so bad. Did you know that Evo won? Yes, I did.
You're right. Yeah. This Organization of American States, we better take a closer look at this.
Right. Yeah. Makes you really raise an eyebrow.
I liked how he brought in intersectionality a little bit too, just like name checking the culture wars nonsense that the right is trying to keep going in order to distract from the real stuff that's happening in the world.
Yeah, it's just content for them.
It's also, that's the labor base. That was even pre any rhetorical strategies like that. The Workers' Party merged from. It's the same thing we're talking about in the first half. It's social democracy across in the economic realm, and then civil equities for all. That's before that, those rhetorical styles were developed. Let's talk more about this voting thing. Donald Trump's push against mail-in ballot. Wait, did we play one or two in the beginning? I'm sorry, guys.
We played one.
Okay, but two is a related but separate clip.
It's kind of the same thing.
It's kind of the same thing. All right, then we can keep it moving.
Unless,
no, that's fine. There is a different view of social distancing and the movement against it, and that view is best expressed by Samantha Bee's good friend, Glenn Beck. Here he is on the new civil rights movement.
How dare he say that civil rights?
Hold up. I'm sorry, I haven't seen this yet. What the fuck is he wearing?
He's making some deals.
It's like a J. Crew Rough Rider.
Like an anti-grandpa.
It's like some kind of weird version of Teddy Roosevelt.
I'm not totally opposed to the cardigan. All right.
No, me neither.
Let's play this.
Yes. How dare him say the civil rights movement? Doesn't he know what he's saying? Yes, I do know exactly what I'm saying. And just as the American Revolution was a civil rights movement, we are seeing the beginning of something that reflects much of that same sentiment. The struggle of blacks in America is in a category all by itself. But the centuries of racism and violence preceding that movement gave it moral underpinning that really sets it apart. But in some ways, a civil rights movement always has the same basic things. There is commonality between all of these movements, including what I believe is the new civil rights movement right now and the 1960s movement. It's a struggle against an oppressive state, local government, a media that doesn't listen, an institution, all of the institutions that just don't seem to listen. It's a struggle for basic constitutional freedoms and your right to try and work and feed yourself. This is what's at stake. We are being told now, unlike at any other time in the history of the United States, that we all have to stay home and we have to do exactly what the state tells us to do. We can't work unless they tell us to work. No, wait a minute. What happened to our rights? My family moved over here because they could find their own way. They could actually pursue their own happiness.
So, this is just the vintage. This is the it's almost like the alley-oop effect or something, or that's the wrong imagery. But it's the agenda of, let's say, the 1% or the oligarchy filtered through the most pathetic kind of mass propaganda with a fake populist appeal to feed the upper tier of the economy. And again, I said, and I want to be clear because I don't want people to think that I'm contradicting myself, that of course, when those protests started, and those protests have changed, they've really self-marginalized with what you're seeing in Michigan. There were protests, the tenor was very, not the substance, but the tenor and the style of communication was very different, and they required a different response. The people coming out and saying, there's no proper, I can't pay my bills, I need to work, is a fundamentally just different proposition than I'm going to show up at a state house with paramilitary gear and the iconography of cosplaying the extreme far right. That's not mass appealing.
And like the most expensive guns that you can buy.
Absolutely. So basically that whole thing has kind of shifted in the past couple of weeks. But we have the same scenario where Democrats will not deliver a serious substantive package to protect people so that they can stay safe and socially distanced. That is going to be very damaging for the long-term progressive push, because this is going to be another example, by the way, in the cultural memory of the United States, where there was a big government expenditure where people did not feel it in their lives. This is like, and 2008 actually was already better, frankly, because at least you had a somewhat decent stimulus. So you are going to continue, and this is the broad like skepticism of like a Bernie Sanders agenda that you have to overcome with people. That, okay, wasn't that another thing that happened where we had a pandemic and a depression and you were spending trillions of dollars and I didn't get anything, or I got something that was the bare minimum, but you were, you were giving a ton of money to Wall Street. People know that. They know the big outlines of what happened, even if they don't know the specifics. And that is another major dangerous, this is dangerous for any long-term progressive prospects. But that basic thing that he's doing there, we'll get to this in a second. This is just outrageous. We'll get to this in a second. But the basic thing he's doing there is, with that possibility closed of just taking care of everyone so we can be safe and deal with the pandemic, he is, doing the agenda of the Trump administration and Republican governors and Wall Street and the Chamber of Commerce, which is just, we don't want to play unemployment benefits and we want to discipline the labor market, get back to work. So it's the most crude, classic. I mean, this is just classic Americana stuff. This is, the agenda of the country club filtered with the presentation of the survivalist meeting. And that's why, Glenn Beck, that's why he's still in the game after all these years.
What's the civil rights movement where in countries where they're just like, we're going to cover your payroll while your people stay at home until we get this under control? What kind of rights movement is that? Because that's the one I want to be a part of.
I'm guessing that A. Philip Randolph would have said, give everybody health care and take care of their rent. Not let's organize a march so you can go back into a non-hazard paid job and die.
Yeah,
and incidentally, let's make sure, as Mitch McConnell's working to, that companies can't be sued.
Yeah. Well, the right to be exploited by capitalists because you will starve to death otherwise is the most American right of all.
If we don't pack TGI Fridays again, and as soon as possible, the terrorist virus is won.
That's a lot of people who think that. So let's actually, let's do this. Get that shot back up, because this just really is incredible. This is a piece of legislation that was announced, I think yesterday. I noticed Jim Kessler from Third Way. Yeah, Jim Kessler from Third Way was very excited about this.
Thank you.
Bipartisan. What?
I love the thank you exclamation.
What a loser. A bipartisan group of 4 senators proposes 4,000 refundable tax credits. Scroll back up, please. For skill training apprenticeship in a 2- and 4-year programs. We like it. How many jobs? We're at well over 30 million unemployed in a span of several weeks. And have we hit 100,000 deaths yet?
We're going to shortly.
We're close.
Okay. So we are and I think we've hit 5 million cases globally. So this, when we talk about how the Third Way model just doesn't fit, even if you like it. So all this obsession with skill training stuff comes from the 80s and 90s, particularly the 90s. This was the Third Way answer. Republicans, and I mean, no one is extreme as Republicans, but it's like, let's have trade deals, let's deindustrialize, and then let's give tax cuts to rich people. And then, basically just build up a paramilitary force to control peripheral communities who are dealing with deindustrialization. And the Clintonian response was, yes, let's do all of that, but let's also give people some computer training jobs so that they can get jobs in the information sector theoretically, and we can replace, like, I don't know, every one of a couple of jobs we're losing with some type of tech job. This obsession with we're going to globalize, we're going to deregulate, we're going to cut taxes, and we're going to make it easier to ship jobs overseas. And then we're not going to get rid of the safety net entirely. That is the difference. But we're going to redesign the safety net so the safety net is all about capacity building. Now, this stuff did not succeed in protecting vast swaths of the population when we were going through economic booms, when we were going through a tech boom, when we were going through a housing boom. This didn't work in terms of raising, wages started to stagnate, inequality started to increase. Then, of course, over the last couple of years, several years, we've had the acceleration of like the Uber and the temp economy. These people, in the midst of something that is faster and worse than 2008, have come out with a proposal that is a piddling example of something that you could see in the 90s. And they're excited about it. It's honestly, yes, third way is funded by corporations. Yes, of course, Klobuchar and Booker are corporate-oriented Democrats, and they're co-sponsoring with Ben Sass and Tim Scott, who are Republicans. So obviously, there's the financial interest. But ideology is deep. I mean, this is like a religious invocation to do something this embarrassing in a crisis in this scale. It just isn't. And even if you want to defend it, that it's a perfectly nice program and helping people with skills or whatever, sure, that's fine. Throw that in a budget rider somewhere. Okay. If you included this as part of Medicaid expansion and a million other things we need to do, fine, great, whatever. But the idea that this is relevant to the crisis we're in is just, it's demented. It's the only word.
It's like when they have these smart programs, what they mean is smarter than you. Like, we're going to have this paternalistic way of coordinating you into the right use of this $4,000, right? Like, we can't just give people money and like they'd probably use it for self-improvement themselves or whatever they need, right? It has to be this, we're only going to give it to you if you go to this certain school, and fashion yourself into a certain type of labor that, the capitalists that we listen to need right now. Like,
what is a $4,000 tax credit to someone who has no income?
Yeah. Like, I don't even know what the economic principle is that they're trying to put into play here, because our economy has shifted to be more and more service centric for a reason. And those jobs are obviously gone now for the foreseeable future. You're not going to magically create more. I guess they think they're going to create some more like bullshit jobs that people can do from home just by giving people the skills training to do those jobs. It's the tail wagging the dog. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. It's the education. You're still muted, Michael. It's the education myth, all over again, but just now we get Ben Sass involved and some Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that really was the story. The idea that, first of all, that these companies, I mean, even in the best of times, they just don't produce that scale of jobs.
Yep.
There is no industrial equivalent, GM, Ford, whatever. Yeah, we need a ton of people to build cars and the associated manufacturing with those cars. What is the maximum amount of people that you need in the United States to work? I mean, Twitter, Apple, Google. Couple
Not
thousand?
that many. Well,
yeah, if you force them to, like, for instance, police their content with something more than algorithms,
absolutely. Look, if you started to say you are actually a media company, you are actually, these things need to be broken down in constituent parts. There are more jobs there, but even in a much more regulated, much more sane environment, nothing compared to industrial output. It just isn't the same scale.
No.
Right.
I mean, the real jobs that are being created by the tech sector that people can actually get are some of the worst gig economy jobs, right? It's like you're being forced to become an essential worker because you have no other income. And these jobs, the growth of the service sector, the growth of things like Instacart and Uber is predicated on the gap between the averagely employed worker and the underemployed worker, which, by the way, is difficult to measure. The economy has recuperated unemployed people and made them underemployed people who are just competing against one another in a larger and larger pool for less and less money to do the tasks that make the averagely employed worker able to work themselves to death as well. So I don't see this being a stable thing. There's plenty of evidence that the drop in the demand for labor worldwide is not due to a lack of skills. It's not even due to automation. It's due to a process of secular stagnation that has been going on for decades and is a natural part of capitalist development. So not really sure what the tax credit's going to do for that.
I mean, yeah, there's different because other people read this as, the last several years the economy's been humming. There was actually the first tiny, very small increase in wages before this, actually. But that's all from a fundamentally lowered playing field. I mean, that's of underemployment, of worse jobs, of increasing inequality, and
wasn't there
benefits and everything else? Yeah.
Wasn't there also a statistic about how a huge percentage of the jobs created since the recession were like these precarious gig?
I think it's over 50%.
Yeah,
I believe so.
It's a lot.
And it's only going to be worse, obviously, after this. There's no question about that.
And so basically, I mean, not to bring Yang back up again positively, but people are going to need to provide for themselves and more of the essentials of life from sources besides their work income. And so basically, you have to decommodify a lot of this stuff.
That's true, though.
Healthcare
will definitely decommodify. I'm a big universal job guarantee is a biggie, because it empowers unions, and it also allows a funding mechanism for all sorts of essential work and socially valuable forms of work that are never going to get generated by a market. And I think it also provides some actual, again, it's just a huge shot in the arm for unions. But speaking of which, McDonald's workers are striking in Los Angeles. This is part of the Fight for 15. And I just want to play, I'll read the translation. This is a McDonald's worker explaining demands. This is in Spanish. There's subtitles that I will read. This is taking place in Los Angeles. My name is Estrella. I'm walking off from McDonald's and on strike today so we can be respected, get a higher wage due to this pandemic, and respect social distancing. This is happening. This is definitely one of the most positive signals. I don't want to downplay it. I mean, the structural power of capital right now is such that, as I've said, I mean, there's a way you could even think of these trillions of dollars of bailout money as almost an anti-strike fund. They have just unlimited pools of capital practically. But that being said, I mean, the only things about the American government that really work right now are the military and the Fed. But that being said, the strikes are happening across the country and across sectors, and obviously really powerfully in Amazon. And this is both something that we should find ways of practically supporting as much as possible. We were all tweeting out the GoFundMe to support the farm workers in Yakima and Washington that Ronald Reagan was bringing our attention to. I was working really aggressively to support Teamsters that my friend Dustin Gostella works with, is a part of in Philadelphia, to get PPE and other essential things, which of course are not being provided for them. So this is something that people can really look to practically help when there are strike and labor actions. And I think it does have a reverberation in political consciousness that is part of these baby steps towards potential change.
Yep. I mean, like I've said and you've said, working class people all over the place are striking for their rights to not go back to work or to go back to work with hazard pay, but it does not get the same kind of attention as these AstroTurf reopen the economy protests from the media. I wonder why. Also, I think seeing where the action is happening, places like McDonald's and Amazon, it's showing that workers need to be looking outside the existing labor bureaucracy because a lot of these essential industries are not unionized right now, and they should be. And people should be fighting to organize the unorganized, as well as, making existing unions more democratic and more militant. Also, I love the term that this whole thing has given us, right? Essential workers. As soon as you call people essential workers, and these are people whose labor was previously devalued like crazy and paid minimum wage, it's going to be a lot harder to argue that these jobs should not pay a living wage.
Yeah,
definitely check out. There's actually great resources that the mainline ones like the AFL-CIO are actually putting out to help people on the practical building blocks of organizing. And I think it's actually very important that even, unions that, and again, all unions are under siege, period. So we can have, there's important analysis to have, but we also just really need to fight for and protect and be clear too that like a lot of union compromises that have been made are because of basically just a bigger rollback of labor. So we need to be humble and connected with all forms of these struggles as we move forward, not only here, but also to some extent in the internationally, the extent it's possible. I've started on Twitter following International Labor Organization, and it's a very good feed of just organizers, like the mainline ones in the United States, but also in Denmark and the Caribbean, everywhere, talking about essential workers and talking about organizing fights that need to happen right now. Mike Pompeo is in a little bit of trouble. I can't help it on this one. The fact that he literally looks like a pig is just kind of awe-inspiring. And I say this as somebody, I do not eat any pork products at all. I think pigs are actually really cute. And I'm not, but the Secretary of State of the most belligerent, imperialist, U.S. foreign policy on the most grotesque steroids is presided over by this guy that looks like a cartoon that the Viet Cong would write to personify the United States. He's just this disgusting, he gave this speech last year where he was talking about opportunities in the Arctic from thawing, not as, an environmental crisis or something that we need to delicately negotiate with Russia and Canada and, global sea lanes, but just, he's like fish and, oil galore. I mean, just
yeah.
So
his respiration is a little bit too apparent. Also, I've noticed it's it's a bit straight from the livestock auction.
I know. So this guy who looks like he was engineered at some type of horrifying agri lab in Kansas to
Koch Industries.
Yeah, he's just built by Koch Industries. You're going to take care of us foreign and domestic, Mr. Piggy. We got to get rid of Medora, and we got to make sure that the pharmaceutical companies can bio-track people through their phones. Can you do that, Mr. Piggy?
Pompeo.
Yeah, Pompeo. He's just yeah, I can do that. So he apparently is under a little bit of heat for having a State Department employee do stuff like pick up his dry cleaning, appointments for him and his wife to go out and eat, and just sort of generally being a slob and an asshole. More importantly, there is a flare-up right now, and I'll quote now from Politico. Senior officials advised against Trump emergency arms sales to Saudis. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo disregarded the advice of high-level officials at the State Department, Pentagon, and within the intelligence community, in invoking an emergency waiver last year to circumvent congressional review of billions of dollars in arms sales to U.S. allies in the Persian Gulf region, according to 2 former administration officials and 3 congressional sources. That decision was under investigation by a government watchdog who was fired last week at Pompeo's urging, and it has fueled a renewed accusation from lawmakers that the Trump administration bucked the will of Congress and even violated the law when it fast-tracked the weapons sales. The Secretary of State is facing intense scrutiny over the Inspector General's ouster, which has unleashed a flurry of negative stories and a torrent of criticism on Capitol Hill. And of course, Pompeo, to justify the move, went back to the old chestnut of Iranian aggression. Now, the United States and Iran were synchronized, at least in the part of Syria of fighting against ISIS. And of course, the Iranians upheld every aspect of the nuclear deal with the J5, with the Security Council +1, which the Trump administration tore up in violation of the treaty of international law, and then went on a belligerent campaign against the Europeans and others for trading with Iran, which was absolutely legal according to they even and then it culminated obviously in the assassination of General Soleimani at the airport in Baghdad. Now, the bigger story here is that there's actually some pressure in the global arms market. The United States still leads the way, but there's some good competition from China. And a major focus of U.S. foreign policy from both parties, and of course, as always, accelerated under Trump, is to get arms sales deals. I mean, this is a major part of not only our exports, but also even things like aid. I remember people always used to talk about how, Egyptian foreign aid was always, a lot of it was funneled through domestic arms contracts, which were then just shipped to the Egyptian army. And of course, this is all happening while we're backing the Saudis in an ongoing genocide in Yemen. So Pompeo's getting heat for this. And it's clear by every indication that this firing was some form of retaliation. And there's no reason, obviously, to believe a single word that Pompeo or Trump says about anything. But here he is, in spite of this story. And again, we just read from Politico. I mean, this is very obvious. This was related back to some of the controversy, basically the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and other pressures inside the defense establishment of the United States around how to deal with Saudi. The Trump administration doesn't care. They want to muscle through those sales. They did. Inspector General speaks out, concerned. Then he's fired. Well, seems pretty obvious, but here's Mike Pompeo's response.
I recommended to the president that Steve Linick be terminated. I frankly should have done it some time ago.
What that means. He says he mentioned it. So what specifically has Mr. Linick done?
Yeah, unlike others, I don't talk about personnel matters. I don't leak to y'all. And
so did he leak?
Yeah, I'll just say this. I can't talk. I can't give you specificity. We'll share with the appropriate people the rationale, but no there should be no mistake.
There's the official. Is there a secret as to why he was fired?
May I answer the question, if you will? I appreciate the question. Let's be couldn't possibly have retaliated for all the things. I've seen the various stories that like someone was walking my dog to sell arms to my dry cleaner. I mean, it's all just crazy. It's all crazy stuff. So I didn't have access to that information. So I couldn't possibly have retaliated. It would have been impossible to those questions. I don't know the scope. I don't know the nature of that investigation other than what I would have seen from the nature of the questions that I was presented. I did what was right. I don't know if that investigation is continuing. I don't know if that investigation has been closed out. I don't have any sense of that.
Real quick, I'll get back to this, but what's the status? We're not on?
Let's just finish this clip, and then we'll...
Okay, so we'll just finish this clip and then... He wasn't doing some sort of good... What happened? Didn't know that the guy had criticized him, but he knew other things about personnel that he won't talk about? And then he brought in the other stuff, which is, again, has been reporting, not that he hired that he sold or whatever the dumb kind of joke he was making there. The idea was that he was using people in the State Department to run errands for him. It's not.
So
seems like an issue.
It's a Zoom issue. Sorry,
it's a Zoom issue. All right, guys.
Out of our hands.
Sorry for
People
this.
keep telling me that Zoom is bad and we shouldn't use it.
Well, Zoom is bad. Grubstake is a good episode on that, but right now it's the most available, so that's what we have.
All right, folks. Sorry about that. Don't know what happened. We'll see you tomorrow. Take care.
1 second here.
No, somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught.